Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to Strangers in Jerusalem YouTube channel. Thank you for the support. Before we get to the clip, please subscribe and like the video, and also check out my book. You can get it on Amazon. It's called A Stranger in Jerusalem, Seeing Jesus as a Jew. Let's start by looking back at the Hebrew Bible in the origins of the Messiah. So according to the New Testament, first century followers of Jesus referred to him, among other terms, lots of different terms, but they referred to him as Messiah, Son of God, Son of David, Son of Man, but also his adjudicators referred to him mockingly as King of the Jews. For many Christians today, these terms typically refer to a divine being who came in human form to provide salvation to humanity. But it's important to understand that when and where this notion of Messiah originated and how those titles, Son of God, Son of David, Son of Man, and King of the Jews, relate, if at all, to messianic notions and to Jesus. Messianism, as we call it, these notions of Messiah among Jews in the first centuries BC and AD is rooted in the ideology of kingship of earlier Israelite eras, so in the Old Testament. The primary leaders in ancient Israel, particularly priests and kings, were anointed with oil at their coronation, or like in the case of priests, when they stepped into their position. The Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, is chock full of references to the anointing of Israelite kings, usually by prophets. Israelite kings were frequently called the Lord's Anointed or the Lord's Messiah in Hebrew, and then in Greek, it would be the Lord's Christ. In early Israelite literature, days of the Old Testament, the root MSH, or Messiah or Mashiach, in its various forms, meant to anoint or anointed one. This did not denote an awaited future agent of God who would come and deliver Israel from its enemies, like in the end of days or the Messianic era. Instead, anointed ones were simply, it was a term that was referred to the Israelite kings, and during certain time periods, priests. So even though non-Israelite king, like Cyrus of Persia, was called his anointed, so even he was called his anointed. This is the only reference to this title in the book of Isaiah, referring to a king, even in this case, a Gentile king. The Israelite king was not only a Messiah, but a son of God. So surrounding ancient Near Eastern cultures, those of Canaan, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Ugarit, influenced Israelite conceptions of kingship. The ancient Near Eastern kings were thought of by their people, by their constituents, to be divine, and specifically referred to as sons of God. For example, in Assyria and Egypt, kings were thought to have attained divine status at or before birth. So there's one passage where there's one example we have where the king of Egypt in the 8th century, so this is during the time of Isaiah, he referred to himself as, well, here's what he says: I am he who was fashioned in the womb and created in the divine egg, the seed of the God being in me. So he says, flat out, I am of divine race. I'm part God. In contrast, Hittite and Canaanite kings were believed to attain godhood at death. So like those of their neighboring nations, Israelite texts describe the king in relation to deity. So it's the same in Israelite literature. We don't know if they thought that the king was divine or just closely associated with the divine, but it's clear that they are. In many Near Eastern nations, the gods and the kings were associated with shepherd imagery. So, for example, in Egypt, the king was called the Good Shepherd. In Samaria, the king was called Noble Shepherd. Hittite texts talk about their king as the shepherd of mankind, and also Assyrian texts refer to the king as a wise shepherd. So the shepherd imagery throughout the ancient Near East referred to kings. So in Israelite literature, just as God was identified as a shepherd of Israel, so too was the king. This God-king rhetoric in Israelite texts seems to be most salient in the Psalms. Both Jehovah and King David, for example, will rule the sea. This is Psalm 89. Both of them will rule the sea. The enemies of both Jehovah and David will be scattered in Psalm 89. But more explicitly, King David is Yahweh's begotten son in Psalm 2 and his firstborn in Psalm 89. And he will sit at God's right hand in Psalm 110. So who does that sound like? My begotten son, my firstborn son, the king will sit at God's right hand. I mean, that sounds like Jesus, according to the Gospels in later early Christian texts. The notion that the Israelite kings were both messiahs, anointed ones, and sons of God shaped views of the Messiah for later Jews. It seems that during the heyday of the monarchy, Saul, David, Solomon, this time period, early Israelites tended to describe the king in terms that suggested divinity in some sense, or at least very close association with deity. Scholars are unsure exactly how the people viewed this, whether it was actually divine or some sort of a metaphorical language. Regardless of whether Israelites viewed their king as literal or metaphorical sons of God, we do know that Jews, after the exile to Babylon, interpreted the kingship passages in different ways, lots of different ways. And what this did is it led to a multiplicity of messianic expectations in the age of Jesus.